Most people would have walked right past the unit without giving it a second look. But Harold Jennings froze the moment he saw the photo on the auction website. Row after row of tall, cloth-draped frames leaning against the interior walls of the storage unit, so full that the doorway itself seemed to struggle to contain the shadows. There were no boxes, no appliances, no furniture, just shapes. Long, rectangular, unfamiliar shapes that, even through a grainy picture, radiated a presence Harold could only describe as waiting. He reread the listing 3 times, whispering under his breath the same words he used on the rare nights when memory felt closer than sleep. Paintings. They're all paintings. And the idea that dozens, maybe hundreds, of forgotten works sat sealed behind a metal door in some lonely storage yard sent a slow, rising heat through his chest. At 72, after a lifetime of shelving his own dreams, Harold felt a pull he had not felt since he was a young man standing in the back row of a community art show, wondering how to become the person he once thought he could be. For most of his adult life, Harold had pushed aside the part of him that loved art. He had painted in his 20s, taken classes at a local studio, even sketched portraits for neighbors who insisted on paying him with pies or homegrown tomatoes. But the responsibilities of raising a family and the constant arithmetic of bills erased hobbies one by one. He took a job at the manufacturing plant and stayed there until the day the factory closed. His wife, Louise, passed 7 years ago after a long winter of illness, and though Harold kept busy fixing things around the house, a quiet stillness had settled into his days. The walls felt tighter, the nights stretched longer, and sometimes he found himself standing in the garage, staring at the canvas he had never finished. The last painting he had touched before life became something he served rather than shaped. That was why the listing felt more like a whisper than a coincidence. It felt like a small door cracking open in a room he thought had sealed itself years ago. The next morning, while sipping his usual cup of weak coffee at the kitchen table, Harold reread the details and noticed something odd. The unit hadn't been bid on yet. Not because it was expensive, but because the previous owner had a strange history of paying late fees at the last second. According to the site, the man had rented the unit for 9 years and filled it exclusively with framed pieces wrapped in archival cloth. No description, no photographs of the artwork itself. One commenter had written, "Looks like someone emptied a gallery during a move and never came back." That was enough to set Harold's imagination alight. He pictured an eccentric collector, a reclusive painter, or perhaps an estate liquidator who kept the best pieces for himself. And for the first time in years, Harold felt a spark that made him sit up straighter. Maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to reconnect with the world he loved, not as a dreamer, but as someone finally old enough to give himself permission. As he prepared breakfast, the thought kept returning. What if the unit held something important? Not priceless masterpieces or lost museum pieces. Life rarely dealt those cards, but something meaningful. Something created by a hand that once trembled with hope. His father used to say that every painting, no matter how humble, contained a piece of a person's soul, and Harold remembered standing on a crate in the workshop as a child, watching the old man restore damaged frames with quiet reverence. He remembered the smell of varnish, the sound of sandpaper sliding across wood, the way sunlight caught the gold leaf when they laid it carefully against the corners. That memory lived inside him like an unopened letter, and now, staring at the listing again, he felt it tugging gently at him. It was more than curiosity. It was inheritance. Before the auction began, Harold drove to the storage facility just to see the place for himself. The yard stretched wide and empty under a cold sky, rows of metal doors reflecting the morning light like blind eyes. When he approached the office, the young clerk behind the counter confirmed that Unit 104 was indeed still scheduled for sale. "Strange one," the clerk added, glancing toward the rows. "Owner always paid late. Then one day, stopped. Manager says it's floor to ceiling with covered frames." Kind of eerie, honestly. But to Harold, there was nothing eerie about it. There was only curiosity, the pure, simple kind he hadn't felt since childhood. As he walked back to his truck, he imagined lifting those cloth covers one by one, discovering what stories live beneath them. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss how Harold's journey unfolds. Stories like these grow because of people like you who keep them alive with every click and comment. When auction day finally came, Harold sat at his computer with the same nervous anticipation he had felt decades earlier while waiting for the birth of his first child. His fingers hovered above the mouse as bids rose quickly in the early seconds. Then just as fast, the activity died. The price stopped at $1,200, far below what Harold expected for a unit filled with art. The highest bidder suddenly withdrew, some glitch or hesitation removing them from the race entirely. And in that breath of stillness, Harold clicked. His heart thudded once, twice, and the screen flashed green. "Congratulations, you won." He stared at the words, barely breathing, the way a man might stare at the horizon when the sun lifts unexpectedly behind a storm. In that moment, Harold Jennings, retired, widowed, practical, and quiet, became the owner of a storage unit overflowed with paintings he had never seen, from an artist he had never met, for reasons he could not yet imagine. And as he drove toward the facility later that morning, he didn't feel fear or doubt. He felt something he thought he had lost forever: purpose. The steel door of Unit 104 rolled upward with a clattering rumble that echoed to the storage yard, and the sound alone was enough to make Harold stop breathing for a moment, as though he were stepping not into a rental locker, but into a place sacred and untouched. The young facility attendant, an earnest kid named Trevor who looked barely 20, held a handle while Harold steadied himself. Even before the door reached its peak, a cool wave of air drifted out, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of aged canvas, old wood, and the quiet musk of time that only sealed rooms can create. Harold instinctively recognized it. He had smelled it in antique shops, estate barns, and forgotten corners of auctions he used to browse with Louise when they were newly married and dreaming of a life filled with shared hobbies. Now that scent seemed to rise like a memory of everything he had once loved about art, settling around him in a soft, almost reverent hush. As the sunlight crept across the interior, Harold finally saw what the blurry auction photo could not fully reveal. The entire left wall was lined with towering shapes, each wrapped tightly in beige archival cloth, secured with carefully knotted ties. The right wall held shorter but wider frames, stacked horizontally in rows like silent books waiting to be opened. In the center, several smaller pieces leaned against one another, protected by layers of muslin that had yellowed at the edges, suggesting they had not been exposed to light for many years. There were no signs of moisture, insects, or neglect. Whoever owned these pieces had stored them with intention, as though expecting one day to return. Harold stepped inside with slow, deliberate steps, letting the atmosphere settle around him the way a stage curtain settles before the moment of truth. His heart beat with a mixture of awe and something dangerously close to hope. Trevor followed him inside, wide-eyed and clearly impressed. "You hit the jackpot, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying a softness that respected the space. "I've worked here 3 years, and I've never seen a unit like this. People leave old couches, broken lamps, boxes of junk. But this looks like someone packed up a whole gallery." Harold nodded but didn't answer. He was too busy studying the arrangement, noticing small details. The way each frame stood with equal spacing, the precision of the knots securing the cloth, the faint numbers penciled in near the edges of some coverings. This was not someone storing random art pieces. This was someone who understood the value of preservation. The thought made Harold's pulse quicken. Perhaps the owner had been a collector, a dealer, an artist, or maybe a relative had emptied an estate in a hurry and placed the pieces here promising to deal with them later. Only later never came. What mattered now was that Harold was the one standing in front of them, not with a curator's training, but with a lifelong passion that had survived loss, time, and resignation. Before touching anything, Harold took several minutes simply to look. He let his eyes adjust to the dimness, noticing the varied silhouettes. Some shapes were tall and narrow, possibly portrait pieces. Others were wide and imposing, their proportions hinting at landscapes or large statement works. A few frames looked oddly shaped, almost geometric, as though the artist had refused to confine expression to standard borders. Each form carried its own energy, and Harold felt as though he had stepped into a silent choir where every voice waited for its turn to be heard. Only when his breathing steadied did he carefully reach for the cloth covering the nearest piece. His hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from reverence. With a slow, deliberate motion, he peeled back the corner, revealing a gilded frame beneath the dust, its ornate carving still bright enough to catch the thin beam of daylight. Trevor leaned in closer. Wow, even the frame alone looks expensive. It did. The craftsmanship was from a period that valued detail more than speed, a style reminiscent of late 19th century framing, though Harold would need better light to be sure. He didn't uncover the canvas itself yet. He wanted to do everything methodically, one unveiling at a time, the way his father used to unwrap restored pieces with a patience that bordered on ceremonial. Instead, he moved through the unit slowly, inspecting without revealing, building anticipation within himself until it felt almost alive. With each piece he touched, he sensed the weight of the story he had stepped into, as though the paintings themselves were holding their breath, waiting for someone worthy to finally look upon them again. The real surprise came when Harold noticed something he hadn't seen in the listing, a narrow wooden crate tucked behind the largest frame, its edges reinforced with metal corners and its lid secured with rusted screws. It was small enough to be lifted, but heavy enough that when he pressed down with his foot, it didn't budge easily. There were no labels, no markings, no indications of what lay inside. Something about it felt personal, more secret than the paintings displayed openly. Trevor raised his eyebrows. "That wasn't in the pictures," he whispered, as though acknowledging its presence required lowered voice. Harold crouched down for a closer look, running his fingers along the lid. He found a faint handwritten number on the side, 27, and next to it, barely visible, the indentation of a name that time had almost erased. The box suddenly seemed less like an object and more like a question. But Harold didn't try to open it. Not yet. He wanted to understand the paintings first, to build a sense of the person behind the collection. So, returned to the frames, he carefully untied the cloth of the first canvas completely and lifted it away. Trevor gasped quietly. Harold simply stared. The painting revealed a dramatic landscape. Rolling fields beneath a stormy sky, brushstrokes so textured they seemed to ripple with the wind that once moved to the artist's mind. The technique was skilled, confident, emotional. Harold felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. Whoever painted this had talent far beyond hobbyist level. There was depth, mood, presence. Enough to suggest that every painting in the unit might be part of a larger story. One connected by a hand that knew how to command light. They uncovered two more pieces, each equally striking but distinct. One was a portrait of a woman seated in a velvet chair, her expression serene yet distant, painted with the kind of subtlety only practiced artists achieve. The second was an abstract piece, bold colors swirling across the canvas with purpose and rhythm, the kind of artwork that demanded contemplation. As Trevor stepped closer, he pointed to the bottom corner. There's a signature. It's faint, but it's there. Harold squinted, heart racing. The letters were elegant but unfamiliar, a name he didn't recognize. Yet something about the consistency of style suggested the entire unit might contain works from the same artist, or at least from the same circle. Harold felt his world tilt slightly. This wasn't a random lot of discarded art. This was a curated collection, preserved carefully and abandoned suddenly. And now, by a twist of circumstances that felt almost surreal, it belonged to him. But with ownership came the weight of responsibility. The paintings deserved to be understood, researched, and valued properly. And for the first time in years, Harold felt something awaken inside him, a sense of purpose that reached deeper than simple excitement. It felt like destiny tapping a patient finger against his shoulder. As he and Trevor continued to study the pieces, Harold realized there was a decision to make. He could treat the unit as a resale opportunity, flipping the paintings for a quick cash at some pawn shop, or he could honor the significance of what he had found, taking time to evaluate each work thoughtfully. The thought of mishandling them unsettled him. These paintings deserved respect. And perhaps, if they proved valuable, they might finally offer him the chance to live the kind of life he had always imagined but never pursued. But before any of that could happen, Harold needed to understand the full scope of his discovery. And that meant opening every frame, every cloth cover, every hidden crate, including the wooden box with a mysterious number carved into its side. Little did he know that what waited inside that crate would not only reveal the truth behind the collection, but also draw him into a chain of events that would test his integrity, courage, and a quiet strength he never realized he still possessed. and that truth will begin unfolding much sooner than he expected. For the next hour, Harold and Trevor worked side by side in a slow, reverent rhythm, peeling back layer after layer of fabric as though unveiling an archive of forgotten worlds. Every painting carried its own identity, its own quiet story, its own brushstroke fingerprint. Some pieces were vibrant and bold, bursting with color in ways that suggested the artist had painted them at moments of emotional fire. Others were subdued, muted, filled with gentle melancholy that reminded Harold of early mornings in small coastal towns where the sky meets the sea in soft gray lines. What struck him most was not the variety, but the consistency of skill. Whoever had created these works was neither a hobbyist nor a casual weekend painter. These canvases belonged to someone trained, someone passionate, someone whose life had been shaped, perhaps even consumed, by art. Halfway through the third row of canvases, Harold noticed a pattern. Each painting, on the back of its stretcher, bore a small penciled symbol, a subtle, almost calligraphic swirl. Not quite a monogram, not quite a signature, something between a personal mark and a code used by gallery curators. He brushed his finger over it gently, trying to recall whether he had seen anything similar in the decades he had spent wandering museums and reading art history books. But nothing came to mind. The symbol looked familiar, in the way a stranger's face looks familiar on a train, recognizable for a reason you can't quite place. It wasn't until they reached a mid-sized painting wrapped in heavy muslin that the first real clue surfaced. As Harold carefully lifted the fabric away, a thin envelope slipped from behind the frame and fell onto the concrete with a soft click. Trevor froze. Harold crouched and picked it up. The envelope was unsealed, yellowed at the edges, brittle enough that he feared it might crumble. On the front, written in ink that had slightly feathered with age, was a single name, A. Loring. He slowly exhaled through his nose. That surname echoed faintly in his memory, though he couldn't immediately place why. Inside the envelope was just one item, a folded letter. The handwriting was refined, almost elegant, the pen stroke steady and expressive. It began with "My dear Andrew," which instantly made Harold's heart thump harder. The letter was not a receipt, nor an invoice, nor the kind of document one usually finds in abandoned storage units. It was personal, intimate, and though Harold knew he shouldn't pry, the situation he was standing in felt larger than simple curiosity. He skimmed just enough to understand the context. The writer spoke of exhibitions, of declining health, of unfinished projects, and of fears that certain works would be misunderstood if released too soon. The final line read, "Keep them safe until the time is right, and promise me you will not let them disappear." Harold folded the letter slowly, his fingertips tingling. He had heard the name Loring before. It had appeared in an article he read years ago about an enigmatic painter whose early career had shown promise, but who vanished from a public eye after a series of controversies involving an influential gallery. Some critics claimed Loring was a genius ahead of his time. Others dismissed him as eccentric and overly dramatic. Regardless, the art world had wondered about the unexplored pieces he supposedly kept from the public. And now, standing in a dim, dusty storage unit, Harold began to realize he might be looking at those very pieces. Trevor must have sensed a shift in Harold's demeanor because he stepped closer. "Sir, should we, I don't know, call someone? Like, if these belong to a famous artist." Harold shook his head gently. "Not yet. Not before we understand what we have." His voice was calm, but carried new weight. He wasn't trying to hide anything. He simply knew the danger of assumptions. The art world could be ruthless. If word got out prematurely, opportunists might swarm. Fraudsters would fabricate claims. Unscrupulous buyers might try to coerce him into selling for far less than the pieces were worth. He needed clarity before he risked confusion. They continued the unveiling with renewed caution. The deeper they went, the more evident it became that this collection had been stored deliberately. Paintings from different stylistic periods appeared, as though tracing the evolution of one artist's life, from daring experimentation to refined mastery. One abstract piece contained layers of paint so thick that they created near sculptural ridges. Another landscape, painted with soft strokes of ochre and green, resembled the countryside on the outskirts of Boston, where Harold once lived as a young man. He paused in front of that one, the memory unexpectedly sharp. Louise had loved scenes like this. Quiet roads, golden fields, trees bowing gently to late summer winds. She always said such paintings made the world seem kinder. For a moment, Harold felt her presence, not as melancholy, but as quiet encouragement. They uncovered 10 more canvases before Harold finally turned his attention back toward the narrow wooden crate tucked behind the largest frame. He had been postponing it intentionally, wanting to understand the paintings first, to build context around the mysterious owner. But now, with so many pieces pointing toward the same conclusion, he felt ready. Trevor helped him carefully pull the crate into better light. Its lid, secured by 4 rusted screws, looked untouched for years. The wood had darkened unevenly, suggesting it had once been near moisture, but had since dried. The crate felt old, not antique, but belonging to a time when craftsmanship was more patient, more human. With gentle pressure and Trevor steadying the sides, Harold worked the screws out one by one. The lid creaked as it lifted, resisting at first, then giving way as if exhaling long-held air. Inside was a single wooden box about the size of a large book, its surface polished and warm-toned, free of dust. Oddly, it contrasted with the rough crate that held it. The box had a small latch, tarnished but functioning. Harold clicked it open. Inside lay 3 items. A leather-bound notebook, edges worn smooth from use, a small cloth pouch tied with red thread, and a narrow wooden panel, wrapped in protective tissue like something fragile and priceless. Harold unwrapped the panel first. What lay inside made the breath leave his lungs. It was a miniature painting, a study, perhaps, for one of the full-size pieces. The subject was a woman's face, painted with such tenderness and skill that it seemed alive even in miniature. The signature in the corner, faint but unmistakable, read A. Loring. Trevor's jaw dropped. "Sir, that's real, isn't it?" Harold didn't speak. He just stared at the panel, sensing that everything in his life, the losses, the quiet years, the long loneliness, had somehow led him to this moment, to a discovery that might rewrite not only his future, but the legacy of an artist forgotten before his time. But as he held that panel, one thought rose above all others. If these works were truly Loring originals, someone, somewhere already knew they were missing, and someone might come looking. The rest of the afternoon unfolded with a kind of deliberate slowness that sharpened every sound inside the dim storage unit. Harold and Trevor continued sorting through the remaining canvases, but their pace had changed. Earlier, curiosity motivated their movements. Now, caution guided them. It felt as though they were no longer simply unwrapping forgotten possessions, but trespassing into a legacy that someone had hidden with care, and perhaps with fear. Harold tried to suppress the unease forming at the edges of his thoughts, focusing instead on the wooden box he had just opened. The leather-bound notebook inside seemed almost too fragile to touch. Its spine cracked, the pages delicately browned, as though each recorded day had lived to the same exhaustion as the artist who wrote them. He held it in both hands, weighing not just the object but the responsibility that came with it. Trevor watched quietly as Harold turned the first page. The handwriting was small, precise, the kind produced by someone who believed deeply in the importance of documenting life. Each entry came with a date, a location, and notes that felt both deeply personal and strangely coded. There were descriptions of color palettes blended to chase specific moods, account of gallery owners who betrayed contracts, and references to private clients who paid for discreet commissions. And then came a set of entries shaded in heavier ink, filled with tension that seeped through the page. Mentions a dispute, of a manuscript that had been misplaced, and of a man who demanded what was never his claim. Harold traced one sentence several times. "I fear he will return, and when he does, these pieces must not fall into his hands." The phrasing carried no melodrama, only warning. He closed the notebook slowly. For the first time since unlocking the storage unit, a thought crept into his mind that he could not dismiss. If these paintings were hidden intentionally, and if the notebook suggested real conflict, then whatever had happened to A. Loring or Andrew, the man addressing the letter, was not merely a matter of fading fame or private decline. It might have been connected to something more serious, perhaps even dangerous, something that made Harold feel the hair rise on the back of his neck. He felt protective instinct grow within him, The kind he used to feel toward Louise during her last fragile years, a determination to be cautious, steady, and not let anyone exploit vulnerability, his own or someone else's. Trevor broke the silence with a hesitant question. "Mr. Harold, do you think someone knows these paintings are here?" It was an innocent question, but it pierced the air with uncomfortable accuracy. Harold looked around the storage unit. The dust patterns, the untouched boxes, the carefully arranged canvases, and realized something unsettling. This unit had not been disturbed for many years. The dust was too even, the fabrics too undisturbed, the floor too clean except for the footprints they had just made. Whoever placed the paintings here had expected them to stay hidden, not auctioned. What troubled Harold most was not the possibility that the owner had intentionally vanished. It was the possibility that someone else had been waiting for the right moment to reclaim what they believed belonged to them. He set the notebook aside and instructed Trevor to rewrap the paintings carefully so nothing looked obviously disturbed. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention before he understood what they were dealing with. After securing the canvases, they lifted the final rug beneath the far corner of the unit and discovered a thick metal tube taped beneath the supporting beam. The tape had grown brittle, and the tube fell into Harold's hands with surprising heaviness. Inside, tightly rolled and sealed in archival paper, was a large charcoal sketch, unfinished yet captivating. The face in the sketch was the same woman from a miniature panel, but younger, with a vulnerability that felt almost sacred. Harold recognized the quality immediately. This wasn't merely preliminary work. This sketch documented a moment the artist couldn't let go of. Trevor let out a low breath. "Who is she?" Harold stared at the drawing, at the unmistakable intimacy between artist and subject. "Someone important," he murmured. Someone he didn't want forgotten. And as he studied the delicate lines around her eyes and the unfinished edge where the artist had stopped mid-motion, he wondered whether she'd been the reason behind the secrecy hinted at in the notebook. Grief, betrayal, unrequited love. Artists often bury their truths in portraits. But sometimes, secrets in art were not metaphorical. Sometimes, they were literal. They packed the charcoal sketch last, placing it inside a protective sleeve before closing the wooden crate. When everything was finally secure, Harold locked the storage unit with hands that felt steadier than he expected. He knew what he had found. He knew its worth, not just financial, but historical. Yet the awareness came paired with something colder, a sensation he couldn't shake even after they stepped into the fading afternoon light. It was the unsettling feeling of being watched. He scanned the lot casually, reminding himself not to appear alarmed. Most of the spaces were empty. The sun cast long shadows across the pavement. Nothing looked unusual. And yet, as they walked toward their cars, Trevor frowned slightly and nodded toward the street. A dark sedan sat across the road. It wasn't moving. It wasn't idling. It was simply there. Trevor squinted. "You know that car?" Harold shook his head. The sedan drove off a moment later, slow enough to be noticed, but not slow enough to be classified as suspicious. Yet the timing, it had appeared only after the door to the unit had closed, forced Harold's heartbeat into a firmer rhythm. Trevor exhaled. Well, that felt weird. Harold didn't respond. He simply placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Help me load the crate," he said. The tone of his voice made Trevor straighten. Together, they lifted the wooden crate into back of Harold's car, then slid the wrapped canvases in after it. Everything fit, but barely. Harold strapped them down with precision that betrayed his tension. Before closing the trunk, he paused, silently acknowledging the magnitude of what he was taking home. As they prepared to leave, Harold paid Trevor for the day's help and added a little extra, thanking him for his care. But Trevor shook his head. "If you need help tomorrow or the next day, I'm in, especially if this turns into something dangerous." There was a gentle sincerity in the boy's voice. He wasn't trying to be heroic. He simply wanted to do what was right. Harold nodded with gratitude. He had not expected an ally, but it comforted him more than he admitted. Driving home with the paintings behind him, Harold kept checking his mirrors. At first, it was habit. Then it became necessity. 2 blocks from the storage facility, he noticed the same dark sedan behind him. It didn't tailgate or speed. It simply remained there, an unervingly precise distance. turning whenever he turned, slowing whenever he slowed. The city had been full of cars earlier, but as the route grew quieter and the sun dipped lower, the sedan's presence became unmistakable. Harold's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and for the first time in years, he felt the sharp pulse of adrenaline he hadn't felt since his youth. He didn't speed up. He didn't panic. Instead, he made a slow, deliberate decision. He drove to a crowded grocery store parking lot, pulled into a well-lit space, and turned off his engine. The sedan rolled past the entrance but didn't follow him inside. It continued down the street at an even pace, disappearing behind a row of trees. Harold watched until the taillights vanished completely. He exhaled shakily, unsure whether he had just imagined everything. But deep down, he knew he hadn't. Someone had been watching. Someone knew the unit had been opened, and someone wasn't ready to let the past remain hidden. The following morning unfolded with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial, as if Harold's small home had willingly quieted itself in anticipation of the day ahead. A soft winter light filtered through the curtains, brushing the crate and the canvases stacked neatly along the dining room wall. Harold paused by them before brewing his first cup of coffee, studying the faded edges of protective wrappings and the thin lines of dust disturbed by their arrival the night before. Even now, after all the discoveries and the uneasy shadows cast by the sedan that followed him, he felt an almost reverent awe. He wasn't just standing in front of store belongings. He was standing before a preserved legacy of a man who had lived through passion, conflict, and secrecy, leaving behind pieces that demanded to be seen, valued, and protected. He spent the morning in deliberate motion, preparing each painting for transportation to the appraiser recommended by Trevor's art teacher. Though the appointment was set weeks in advance, he had managed to secure an early evaluation by explaining the fragile nature of the discovery and his desire to proceed responsibly. Harold checked every strap, every corner of foam padding, and every label on his handwritten inventory, ensuring that he would carry no unanswered questions with him. By the time Trevor knocked on the door, cheerfully punctual, wearing the same work gloves as before, the tension in Harold's shoulders had eased into focus. Trevor helped load each painting into Harold's car with an attentiveness that mirrored the older man's own, and together they drove to a quiet district where the appraiser's studio occupied the renovated floor of an old library. The building felt appropriate, full of archived stories and gentle echoes, a place where forgotten histories were treated with dignity rather than haste. Inside, the specialist, a woman whose calm matched the stillness of the space, greeted them with practiced courtesy. She moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades handling delicate masterpieces, and Harold felt reassured as she examined the first canvas with methodical care. She confirmed what he already suspected. The paintings were not simple forgotten amateur works, but genuine pieces from a reclusive artist once represented by a private gallery on the West Coast. She recognized a signature beneath the layered varnish, identified the style period, and even traced the limited exhibition records that aligned with the dates in the artist's notebook. As she inspected the miniature portrait of the woman, her expression softened into quiet admiration. "These were meant to be protected," she said, as though speaking to both the paintings and the man who now stood before them. And when she gently unrolled the charcoal sketch, her brows lifted with academic delight, a reaction that told Harold everything he needed before she even spoke. "This," she added, "is the kind of piece collectors fight to own, not because it is polished, but because it is personal. These sketches rarely survive." Harold listened with a growing sense of gravity. None of this felt like fortune falling into his lap. It felt like responsibility, a chance to do right by the work, the artist, and whatever story lay behind the man who had preserved them in secret. When the appraiser provided a valuation range, the numbers almost felt surreal. With a structured, legitimate sale, handled by a reputable gallery, the collection could easily bring in $200,000 or more. But she warned him to avoid pawn shops, online flippers, or private buyers with vague intentions. "When art vanishes in the wrong hands," she said quietly, "it sometimes never resurfaces." That warning struck deeper than she could have known. Harold remembered the sedan, the Polaroid shadow, the echo of secrecy woven into the notebook entries. He understood that moving carefully wasn't just good advice. It was necessary. Trevor accompanied him home, and together they resecured the paintings inside the house, this time distributing them in safer, less visible placements. Harold insisted on walking Trevor to his car, grateful for the boy's loyalty and presence during a time when one misstep could invite unwanted attention. Before leaving, Trevor hesitated, then asked gently, "Mr. Harold, are you scared?" Harold smiled, not dismissively, but with the quiet honesty of someone who had survived grief, uncertainty, and the long years of adjusting to solitude. "Concerned," he answered, "but not scared. I've lived long enough to know that fear only grows in the dark. As long as we're careful, and as long as we shine a light where someone tried to leave shadows, we'll be fine." That night, Harold sorted through the remaining items one last time. He opened the notebook again, tracing the lines where the artist expressed worry about a man who wanted to claim what never belonged to him. He realized something important. Fear may have driven the artist to hide his work, but it didn't have to control the future of those paintings, or Harold's life. He drafted a letter to the gallery the appraiser recommended, detailing his willingness to consign the pieces responsibly and protect their provenance. He made copies of the notebook pages that contained dates, names, and potential clues, then placed the originals in a sealed envelope to be delivered to the attorney recommended by the appraiser. By placing everything into proper hands, he ensured that the truth, whatever it was, would no longer be trapped in silence. The following weeks unfolded with a steadiness that allowed Harold's life to expand rather than contract. The gallery accepted the collection and handled the negotiations with professionalism that made him feel both protected and respected. The dark sedan never returned, nor did any shadowy figure attempt to reclaim what he now understood were never stolen items, but abandoned ones, hidden to avoid someone else's greed rather than the artist's shame. The sale proceeded discreetly, and when the final totals came through, Harold sat quietly at his kitchen table, staring at the printed statement. The number was large enough to transform the remainder of his life. Not extravagantly, but meaningfully, gently, and with dignity, the way an older man who had spent decades putting others first deserved. He used a portion of the money to clear debts and repair the creaking parts of the house he had long learned to live around rather than fix. He funded a small art scholarship at the high school where Trevor studied, naming it simply "For Those Who See Beauty Where Others See Clutter." He invested another portion to secure a slower, more peaceful retirement. And then, with the remaining amount, he did something Louise would have loved. He rented a small studio downtown with tall windows, good northern light, and shelves for paints he no longer had to ration. He began sketching again, not to sell, not to impress, but to occupy the hours with something that made him feel alive rather than merely present. Trevor visited often, helping him stretch canvases, learning how to prime surfaces, and listening to the quiet stories Harold shared. Not about danger or hidden cars, but about patience, craft, and the gentleness of doing something well simply because it mattered. The gallery later sent Harold a framed, high-resolution photograph of the miniature portrait of a mysterious woman, a gift of thanks for entrusting them with such significant work. Harold placed the photograph in his studio, not as a reminder of the money he gained, but of the legacy he protected and the man whose art he helped bring into the light. Months later, during a gallery exhibition featuring the restored Loring pieces, Harold stood among strangers who admired the paintings he had once unwrapped in a dusty storage unit. No one knew the full story. Not the Jeopardy, not the trailing sedan, not the notebook whisper with warnings. They only saw the beauty of the art and the gentle reverence with which it had been presented. Harold felt Louise beside him in that moment, not as a memory, but as presence. He realized then that discovering the paintings had never been about luck or danger. It had been about honoring something fragile, something lost, something waiting to be understood. And as he walked home through the warm, late spring air, he understood the moral he had earned, not found. Life sometimes hides its gifts in plain sight, disguised as burdens, uncertainties, or dusty forgotten corners. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to open the door anyway. To lift the tarp, to read the note, to follow the thread even when you don't know where it leads. And goodness, when applied steadily and without rush, has a way of unlocking more than safes and storage units. It unlocks years, hope, possibility. Harold didn't become a wealthy man in the grand sense, but he became a fulfilled one, a man with purpose, connection, and light. A man who kept faith with a stranger's art and, in doing so, rediscovered his own. The final painting he completed that year, a gentle landscape with quiet skies, hung in his living room, not signed with flourish, not painted with urgency, but finished with patience and gratitude. He titled it simply, "What Remains." And what remained more than anything else was peace.